District of Conservation is sponsored by CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thank you so much for listening. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Happy Monday. Hope you're doing well. I did a conservation adjacent activity this weekend, going to the Virginia Gold Cup, the 98th annual event, and I got to see some horses run, got a nice tan, ate some good food, and I wanted to segue with that into today's conversation. Hope you guys enjoyed, turkey season. If you're still going into the field, I don't think I'm going to go turkey hunting this year, and that's okay. I have some fishing trips on the docket, but today I want to focus on a rule change pertaining to Colorado and why it'll have national implications. I'm alluding to the U.S. Forest Service potentially closing over 200,000 acres combined to recreational shooting opportunities. I'm going to explain what this rule is, what the context is, and why I think this could invite more incremental bans to stop recreational shooting. That would be bad for conservation, bad for the Second Amendment, bad for our sporting heritage. Given the vague explanation or justification to do this, I bet you some groups, anti-hunting groups that are opposed to expanding access, have to be behind this rule. Possibly they've been going back and forth with this rule since 2013. I think 2019 was when this was really formally proposed, but I bet you there are some groups behind the scenes that are trying to fuel opposition to retaining these openings. So we're going to break it down briefly about what this proposed rule is and how it could affect your ability to shoot recreationally on public lands. If you didn't know this, on public lands across the country, Forest Service lands, BLM lands, and most public land areas with the exception of national parks and some national monuments, there are opportunities to go recreational shooting. This is allowed under the Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson Acts relating to hunting and fishing opportunities, respectively. You're within your right, if you abide by the rules, to go recreate on public lands, including recreational shooting. I think people forget that's an important component to public lands access, the ability to recreationally shoot. But this potential rule to close cumulatively over 200,000 acres, that's a huge chunk of land, if we're speaking candidly, could impact Coloradans and those close to Denver in that vicinity and what it means. Denver, not very nice to Second Amendment supporters, and they, of course, the state capital has also been going in a very preservationist direction. Narrowly speaking, the voters of Colorado basically did ballot box biology, narrowly allowing management of wolves, but they don't want wolves to be managed in the proper channels. And so from the state side, they have these different pressures, Second Amendment restrictions that are coming from the governor and the Capitol. And then you have these rule changes coming on the federal side as well. So I feel very bad for Coloradans. I'm going to preface the rule discussion by that. So this seems to be another attempt to make it harder to be a sportsman in Colorado on all ends. Let's talk about this prospective rule change. This is a new rule, came out May 5th. I will give you some background because this has been going back and forth for a while. This stems from a 2013 proposal. They offer 3 reasons as to why they have to justify recreational shooting closures. According to a document, which will be in the show notes for your reading pleasure, they say that there are 3 reasons that could justify closures here. Residential housing density in these areas, high-use recreation areas on National Forest Service and other government lands, and existing conflicts between recreational shooting and other uses on National Forest Service and other government lands. If you recreate on public lands, you know that people try to mitigate conflict with other activities. And this has been proposed before. They first put out the rule that led to this 2019 rule. Again, first mentioned 2013. 2019 is when they wanted to put this down. A headline from the Colorado Sun in 2018 said the Forest Service wants to ban target shooting on 1,100% more acreage in 2 of Colorado's national forests, which leads to this April 2023 prospective rule change. Let's read from the Forest Service, the USDA service, because it falls under that. Dated April 28th. Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forests work toward implementation of shooting closures identified in the 2019 rule. I'll read from the press release. The Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forest and Pawnee National Grassland is committed to working towards implementation of a 2019 Recreational Shooting Sports Management Decision and Forest Plan Amendment, identifying, quote, unsuitable areas for shooting on National Forest System lands. These closures are contingent on shooting ranges being constructed in certain geographic areas to provide for safe shooting opportunities where dispersed opportunities are limited. Implementation of closures is also contingent on compliance with public notice and comment procedures required by the John D. Dingell Conservation Management and Recreation Act, or Dingell-Johnson. The forest manager, Monty Williams, said, I'm so thankful for the amazing Northern Front Range Recreational Shooting Sports Management Partnership work that was done to get us to a decision that balances safety and the need for recreational shooting opportunities. This is an important step as we move towards implementation of our safety closures while providing new developed opportunities for recreational shooting enthusiasts. Currently, the Devil's Nose target range on the Clear Creek Ranger District is under construction and the Clear Creek Shooting Sports Park is under development. Once those rangers open, closures could begin in their associated geographic regions as outlined in the 2019 decision. A range opening will also initiate closures in Grant County and Northern Larimer County, where many dispersed shooting range opportunities still exist. I actually drove by a public targets shooting range on National Forest lands, maybe one of these places when I was in Colorado last fall. They say the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act was signed in between the forest releasing its draft and final decision and such. The forest is following the procedure outlined in the act, including a 90-day comment period following the notice in the Federal Register. That rule was officially issued on May 5th. So they say that provided that new ranges are going to open, these closures are justified. That sounds really nice and dandy. And if we're to take this Forest Service at value, which is a component to the Biden administration, are we really to trust that they will not reduce access to public lands? Will you get those rights? Will you get that access rather restored? If they are going to hold up their bargain to reopen public target shooting ranges, I'm not optimistic on that front. And I want to point you with a case study. We have seen these attempts to close public lands before. In this instance, if this rule proceeds, 226,113 acres identified as unsuitable for shooting will be closed. And this includes 104,000 acres of that, including nearly 95,000 acres on Devil's Nose and 46,000, a little over that, Clear Creek shooting range. In addition, the Dingell-Johnson notice will be provided at a future date to complete implementation. If we really believe that these so-called unsuitable lands, acres for shooting, will be closed and that they're going to reopen it in the future, if we believe their good faith, if they're operating in a good faith argument, what this administration has done on conservation doesn't lead me to believe that these acres will ever be, even a comparison of them would ever be reopened. We see similar closures happening on national park lands. If there's a special arrangement, a national park and preserve where hunting is allowed, similar closures on other National Forest Service lands, Fish and Wildlife Service lands. You've heard that animal rights advocates have sued the Biden administration to undo opening of over 2 million acres to new hunting and fishing opportunities under the condition that lead, tackle, and bullets be banned. Alaska is closing 60 million acres to caribou hunting for non-residents of Alaska. So seeing this, and I also want to point to where they create no-go zones and where opportunities lost to go recreationally fishing or hunting or even shooting never are restored. California, for example. I know people love to punch California. I'm from California. I can punch it as much as I want because it's my home state. But I want to point to a very serious case study about why I'm not optimistic about closures ever being reopened in many cases, even though they promise that, yes, it'll be done in a good faith, that they will restore access. California instituted marine life protection areas in the 90s, and maybe a little before that. They said under the guise of protecting sensitive areas, imperiled fish species, that those closures had to be done. They had to be administered. I'm merely paraphrasing, but I can point you to a letter from the American Sport Fishing Association, which will be included in show notes, backing up what I'm claiming. When it was a few years later after implementation, groups like the ASA petitioned to reopen those waters close to these MPAs, these marine life protection areas. Access, unsurprisingly, was never restored. These fishing areas became no-go zones. Recreational fishing opportunities since then have been lost and never restored. That may sound very extreme, but this is a reality, and the proof is in the pudding. Anytime the federal government, especially when guided by preservationists, decide to close things, public access to public lands or waters, those access points are never restored, thus hurting public lands opportunities. We often hear from some conservationists, people who align themselves with preservationists or maybe politically on the left, they often accuse Republicans of attacking public lands. I have yet to see any evidence of that from the last administration having transpired. If we're factoring in how many acres of land that have been closed under this administration since they don't adhere to no net loss, it's in the millions, maybe close to not exactly hundreds of millions, but if we're counting Alaska, the Fish and Wildlife Service lands, just under probably 100 million acres have been closed off or will be closed off to shooting, fishing, and hunting opportunities because of guidance from the Department of Interior, BLM, Forest Service, what have you. We never saw that magnitude of closures. I don't think 1 acre was closed to opportunities. Some people will say, well, because the Antiquities Act was shrunk, you lost access. The Antiquities Act, unfortunately, can be weaponized by preservationists to curtail your ability to recreationally fish and hunt on public lands. So you can't say because of shrinking of Bears Ears or similar monuments, people lost access that way. No. And the opposite, in fact, is true. You lose out on opportunities to fish and hunt anytime there are enlargements that are not cohesive and carefully laid out. So we are seeing these closures, whether it's coming from the White House itself, its agencies, and 200,000 some odd plus acres close to recreational shooting. What impact is that going to have economically in addition to access? And what is to say that they'll stop there? Are they going to look to other national forest lands and say, you know what, we need to, because of these 3 concerns, the aforementioned concerns I mentioned from the 2013 plan, are they going to justify closing other areas to recreational shooting? What about hunting on public lands? This administration, unfortunately, sees no limits to restricting access. The proof is in the pudding. I've laid out many, many case examples. I will link to all these land closures I've alluded to in this episode, but this latest instance in Colorado should definitely have you concerned. You don't have to live in Colorado to be concerned, but what state would be next? What public land heavy state could be targeted, no pun intended, by directives from this administration of this? So if you want to comment on this rule, express your concerns with it, why you think it'll lead to more incremental bans for recreational shooting, hunting, and even fishing, definitely weigh in on it. I will include the comments for you to do. Again, you can fight back on this and oppose the rule. Talk to your members of Congress and get them to oppose this as well. Safari Club has been doing a great job exposing the problems with this proposed rule. Sportsmen's Alliance will definitely jump in. I expect Howl for Wildlife to similarly do this as well. But this is a rule you need to be aware of. It doesn't matter if it sounds nice and well-intentioned. What we've seen historically is anytime they close public lands to opportunities, you lose that access permanently, no matter any promises of reopenings or future, talk of like all this great stuff. So this is how they operate. This is how the preservationists operate. When you see these closures, do not expect them to ever reopen until you get a new administration. I'm afraid that's when you would see this, if this rule were to go into effect. But so that is what I want to say on this Forest Service rule out of Colorado and why you need to pay attention for incremental attempts, bans rather, that could stem from decisions like this rather. So let me know what you think about this and be sure to submit your comments if you are concerned. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Make sure you're connected to us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And also on your preferred player, we recommend Apple Podcasts, where you can leave us reviews if you really like the content. Share the podcast with friends who may be interested in learning more about what's trending in conservation and the related industries that entangle with it and sometimes work against it as well. Thanks for listening to the show, and stay tuned for the next episode.